Happy International Day of Persons with Disability, Sharon.
I'm the same back to you.
How are you? Did you know, I didn't know that the theme is advancing social progress.
Yeah, I didn't know that was the theme.
Yeah.
So.
I wondered if anyone had any questions. So given today's theme is on, given it's International Day of Persons with Disability, our focus for today is on human rights. And some of the questions that we got were around restrictive practices. But if you do have any questions that you want to ask, or, now's your time to ask Sharon and myself, any questions, particularly around human rights, restrictive practices, which obviously infringe on human rights, please do feel free to type it in the chat. But I thought, Sharon, we had an interesting question that I wondered if you wanted to tackle. And it's around, how do you want to frame it? It's around, I think, when practitioners come into family homes and they see parenting practices that, if it were a paid provider, would be considered a restrictive practice at best, and in some cases a prohibitive restrictive practice at worst, or not even a restrictive practice, kind of beyond restrictive practice to abuse in some circumstances. That's a tough situation for any practitioner to be in. How do you go about that? What do you do?
It is a really difficult situation to manage, and a lot of it is going to depend on the relationship you've got with that person as well, and how well you know them, and exactly what you've seen. And a common one that I get brought to me, either in supervision in particular, but the sort of thing I've seen myself in practice, is parents who have got young children and they're doing a sort of a bear hug type thing, which is really a basket hold, so would be prohibited. And they think they actually, whenever I've spoken to parents about that sort of thing, they'll often say, well, I find it the easiest thing to do, or this calms them, or, any range of kind of reasons why they might do it. But they don't necessarily understand the risk associated with that. I think that's the important thing. So if, and it depends on and I'll talk about an instance I've had recently in a moment, but there are a range of responses that you might need to use in this situation. But in that sort of situation where I think this is well-meaning but misunderstood, I would try and have that conversation with them and explain what the risks are. But I'd also try and provide an alternative piece of advice as well. So instead of doing that, why don't you try this? Why don't we try some distraction? Why don't we, so look at the specific situation they're trying to manage and see what is the best alternative piece of advice I can provide them in that particular instance. Because most of the time, they don't actually need a physical response, but they've sort of found a not great solution to a difficult problem, and it's just become almost like a habit thing.
Or they don't know what else to do in a lot of circumstances. Like parents they don't get a break. They're in it 24/7, and a lot of them are in survival mode. They're just trying to keep their heads above water. And I think that's something that oftentimes practitioners maybe struggle a little bit with, is they'll come up with these strategies, they say, oh, we want this strategy to get this young person off the iPad. But for that parent, where that young person, their child, being on the iPad for an hour means maybe that they get that bit of respite, or that they're not having that confrontation that, as parents, we know that our kids can give it to us in ways that they don't give to other people.
And they keep on giving.
Yeah. For better or worse, bless them.
That's the thing. So I think it's in most instances, what I would try and do is work with those parents.
Now, our first job is to educate.
Absolutely. And they don't, like I say, they don't realise that what they're doing is so risky. And particularly if you've got a young person who perhaps has hypermobility, let's just take that as an example, they don't necessarily understand the increased risk that they're placing that young person at, or asthma, or any of those sort of healthcare conditions. And in my experience, once I've explained that to them, they're only too willing to look at what the alternatives are. They just didn't know another way.
Can I just stop you right there? How would you explain this to me? Let's say, for example, I am a desperate parent, and my child is physically punching me in the face. Okay, they're 10 years old, and I'm speaking very frankly. The child gets so aggressive. They're punching me in the face. They're biting me, and the only thing I can do is kind of hold them down, or hold their arms across, or sit down on my lap, their chest, something like a basket hold or a bear hug.
Yeah.
How would you explain that to me as that parent?
Yeah, so I would obviously pick my time for the sensitive conversation. Yeah. I'm not going to do it when you're already stressed and you're at the end of your tether. Yeah, so I'm going to find the right moment. Yeah. And then I would look to say, I know that you've found this solution and that's working really well for you at the moment. And do you remember the other day when I came and, you just had a bit of an incident? You were sat on the bed with Johnny and you'd got him on your knee and you got him in that hold. I know that you've found that as a solution and that's working for you, but we need to have a conversation about some of the risks that there might be that you won't be aware of. And I'd be really clear that I understand this is a solution you've come up with and it's working for you at the moment, but we have to find another alternative because of these risks. And the risks are, obviously difficulty in breathing. If little Johnny's got hypermobility, you could overextend his shoulders and actually cause a dislocation or a subluxation. You could overextend his wrists and cause some serious injury, and at worst you could actually break his arm or something. And obviously you don't want to do that, and I'm here to support you and ensure that those sort of risks don't occur. Mm-hmm. And so then part of our job, as usual, is always to look at what is the function of this behaviour, why is this behaviour happening, and work quickly to resolve that, but at the same time provide an alternative. And for some families, the alternative they do need in that brief period of time is some training in how to safely support their child. There are only a few providers who do that sort of training here in Australia, but that training is available. Mm-hmm. So I know that as some people have spoken about Andy McDonald's training, a few people have had that, the Studio 3 training.
The low arousal training.
Low arousal stuff. They provide training for parents. Mm-hmm. Jason Mason in South Australia provides training for parents. And MANT Training, who now have a centre here in Queensland but operate across Australia, they also provide training for parents. And I believe Team Teach has also done that on individual basis. Now, my role isn't to recommend particular training providers. There are other variations, just like with chocolate. It's not just Cadbury's. But I'm just putting that out there that some parents, for a limited period of time, may need to use training and may need to receive training in order to keep themselves safe, keep other siblings safe, and keep that young person safe while we get a behaviour support plan in place.
That's right, because we're often, we're talking about individuals, but in family circumstances, there's often other children that we have to consider the safety of as well. And so we're considering the safety and the needs of one, but we have to balance that with the safety and needs of others as well, particularly within that family environment, or sometimes within that school environment, where there might be somebody dysregulated in the classroom, gets evacuated every second day or things like that. And I find that that's where people really get frustrated, is they're like, how can I safely support the individual who's having an unmet need, as well as support the other needs of the other people in this environment as well?
Well, and a couple of years ago at one of the ACRRE conferences, there might be some people online here who saw this presentation. We had a fella called Glyn Connolly from the UK come and present, and he was a panel member for a long period of time for the Restraint Reduction Network and also worked as an assessor to that scheme. But prior to that, he'd developed an approach for working with family carers and the broad family with children and young people who had very high and complex needs and high risk behaviours. And their approach looked at, or their framework provided a way to supplant training for the whole family into the family home whilst you were also doing the behaviour support. So they did a lot of training around understanding behaviour and de-escalation and the behaviour support plan itself. But they then also, where necessary, supported that with physical skills training, sometimes for siblings as well, to ensure they could keep themselves safe. And the idea of this was to actually keep children in the family home who otherwise may have had to even go into care short term, or may have had to go into a care situation in the longer term. And so their role was to keep those children at home and work with the family to the extinction of the use of physical restraint. And often the families that came to them, well, most of the families that came to them were already using homemade techniques. That's what they were already doing. And so their role was about making things much safer for the family as a whole.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting point you're saying about extinction-based procedures. And what you said earlier is that it's not just enough to say, stop doing that thing, or here are the dangers, here are the risks. You have to give people an alternative to do instead.
Most of the crazy things that I've seen in terms of restraint that people have come up with have arrived by virtue of the fact somebody's found a poor solution to a very difficult problem. It's a rare day when I'd say what I'm seeing is an intentionally abusive situation. Now, I know, and that's not, I'm not trying to minimize the harm that could cause to the person themselves. Absolutely not. But very often the genesis is in somebody getting inventive in trying to solve a problem and thinking, oh, this will make it safe for everyone, without necessarily understanding the greater risk that they're posing. And that's both in families but also in other situations, in other in residential services, in schools in particular. I used to do a lot.
I find that a lot. I'll say, particularly in out-of-home care, when it comes to risk, it seems to be a counterintuitive way of dealing with risk. I see this a lot in residential care and residential out-of-home care, where we're very concerned about risk and our risk appetite and the risk of, and it's a very genuine concern around risk. But a lot of times the natural response to risk is to say, there's a risk, we need to get rid of it. We need to stamp it out. We need to have zero risk, so we need to contain. We need to contain, so that we can stamp out this risk. This is how we're going to mitigate it so that we have zero risk. And what they don't actually realize is that by seeking to contain, is that they're actually inadvertently creating more risk.
More risk. Yeah.
Especially when it comes to, let's say, out-of-home care or children, when you are completely trying to mitigate risk by saying we're going to remove, we're going to constrain, we're going to restrict, without, this is what, like, extinction without supplementary skills as to what are we going to teach. Extinction by itself is not an effective or sustainable behavior change strategy. We have to integrate it with what adaptive skills we're going to be teaching instead. And that's why when I see risk mitigation procedures that are all about having zero risk and stamping out and containing, my first job is educating, saying, hey, actually, you're probably creating more risk, because what's going to happen is this young person, let's say if it's a residential care living arrangement where they turn 18, what I say is they fall off the edge of a cliff. They turn 18 years old. They've had a wraparound care team cast of thousands that have done all these reports and assessments and things around and for and, on behalf of, but we haven't spent a lot of time in building up skills and repertoires and resilience to go out into the wide world. And you're 18, all these supports fall off, and you're out in the big wide world, and boom goes the dynamite, because we have no resilience or skills. And that's where the real risk and the real harm happens in these scenarios.
Absolutely. And on that topic of of choosing risk, of trying to close down risk, there's a piece of training I do which is around understanding. It's basically understanding more about physical restraints and mechanical restraints and stuff like that. Actually understanding more technical aspects of that, but not physical skills training, just understanding risk and stuff. And one of the questions that I pose is I put a list of things up and sort of say to people, tell me which you think carries least risk out of these interventions. And people have a strange idea of the risk continuum in restraint. They really do. And it's fascinating because, you could put 100 people in that room and we'd probably have nearly 100 different answers in terms of where the continuum of risk lies in these examples, because actually it's a really difficult question to answer, because all of these things are equally risky given a certain set of circumstances.
Yeah.
The use of a restrictive practice has to be based on that particular circumstance and understanding it. And that's where the danger lies, in applying a practice that you've seen in one place and just plonking it down and using it in another scenario or example. You can increase risk exponentially by doing that. And that's the problem with restrictive practices, is getting people to understand that the continuum of risk is just it's an idea that people talk about and is put out there, but you can't say, for example, a protective action is less risky than a two-person physical restraint. I'll just pick those two. You can't say that, because in some circumstances that protective action might be more risky than the two-person restraint. But if you just say, is a protective action less risky than a two-person restraint, or which is the most risk, most people will go, oh, the two-person restraint, because what they've picked up is the more people that are involved, the higher the risk. That's also true, we know that. But based on the set of circumstances you're faced with, that two-person restraint could actually be safer than the protective action. And it's understanding those nuances. And I know I keep repeating myself and I sound like a broken record, but we're not actually giving people the skills they need to understand restrictive practices and to reduce the use of restrictive practices. We're not giving them those skills. And even just that as a simple example, I know will blow some people's mind. Other people will go, yeah, get it completely. And I already knew that. Thanks very much. But I know, because of the way I've delivered that information in groups, a lot of the time people are like, oh my God, I'd never looked at it like that. I hadn't looked at the complexity or looked at it in that complex way, in the perspective that I'm kind of putting to them.
Yeah. If that has blown your mind a little bit, please feel free to put that in the chat. Why do you think it is, though, that people think about risk in that kind of linear way, or that blows people's minds a little bit?
Because I think because there's some sort of populist information that's put out like that, sometimes by training providers, and that's not me knocking training providers at all. What they're trying to do is provide information in a way that is digestible to people, so they tend to scale their training in such a way that it gives that impression. And they don't necessarily have the time in their training, and it's actually it's questionable whether it's their role to help people to understand those sort of complex issues, because I'm talking about application in context. They don't necessarily, they're training other people. Those other people have to decide about application in context. So, but we've got a bit of a gap in how we're training people to understand all of that.
How do we fill that gap?
Oh, it is training.
Is this something that you think, should this be part of a mandatory training? Like, if you're going to be a behavior support practitioner, I know it's like mandatory training in this and that, and also I think we have to dig deeper into what training really means. Like, an hour webinar is not a training.
It's difficult because from my perspective, yes, absolutely, we need to provide that information to people.
Yeah.
But what I also know is there's so much pressure on time, and there's so much compliance that people are managing, and soon there's going to be more compliance. And if we think about the human rights of people, are they protected by more compliance? Well, the easy answer to that is absolutely, they are not. The research tells us that more compliance and compliance heavy environments do not make places safer for people. They actually, it's the other way round. They are more likely to drive practice underground and increase risk to people. Somebody's put something in.
I see that. I think people work in a compliance model, and sometimes inexperienced practitioners might copy and paste strategies without personalizing approaches and strategies for the person and thinking about protecting their human rights and reducing risk for the person and providers. And that speaks to me more about person and right-centered practice. If you're copying and pasting reports but I also understand what Sam is saying about the difficulties with resources and the challenges with the limitations around that too, being ethical and effective in a resource tight environment.
Yeah, and what Sam is saying is basically just supported the point I've made. The more compliance heavy environments don't lead to greater safety for people.
Right. Yeah.
And we know that. And if you want to look at that stuff in the context of of restraint, go and look at Michael Nuno's paper, which did a review of deaths of children in care over 20 odd years. And if you want it, I've got it. I can circulate that. In fact, I can look at it. I'll see if I can find it and put it in the chat.
Yeah.
I'll see if I can work out how to do that. If I can't, I'll have to send it to people. But basically, in summary, what he says is, the more compliant heavy organisations were the ones that were more likely to put children at risk. But the organisations that had culturally appropriate bases and worked in a continuous improvement sense and all of that, they were more likely to produce good results. I mean, I'm summarising a bit here, obviously, but that's really...
But it's embedded within the culture rather than a tick boxing exercise that we're doing this thing because we say we have to, rather than we're embedding it because we're living it. This is... Yeah. And going back to our question too, of one of the questions we had was, how do we challenge parents and service providers, I will say, when there are questionable either practices, whether they're restrictive practices, whether they're abusive practices, whether they're, what have you. One of the fears, particularly new practitioners have, is how do we challenge that when as soon as I do, they're going to fire me and I'm going to get kicked off the case?
What I say to people when they're in this situation is, your duty of care is to the person. Right. That person is actually the person who you're contracted to provide support for. And ultimately, if what you're seeing is abuse, you're obliged to report that, regardless of any other sensitivities that sit around that. You're obligated to do that. The standards are very clear on that. The rules are very clear on that. And so you're, so is the code of conduct. So from my perspective, I am pretty hard-lined on that, and I have reported people in that situation.
I have too.
In one instant, I had a conversation with the person first and said, I'm going to have to do this. I'm going to have to do this for these reasons.
I often do. If I have the relationship, I will often I'll have a conversation with that I have to report it, and I'll say why, because if it's safe for me to do so, depending on, there's different circumstances. But oftentimes, going back to what you're saying, people typically aren't doing the wrong thing because they're bad people. People are typically engaging in practices, unless it's straight up abuse. If it's a questionable restrictive practice, it's generally because usually parents or even providers are in a desperate situation. Maybe they themselves are unsafe and they genuinely don't know what else to do.
Yeah, and I think in those situations, you're dealing with something different and you're able to have that conversation, and you can mould and change practice.
Yeah.
And so you take those opportunities and you do that because ultimately that is in the best interest of the person.
Yes.
So, but where it's out and out abuse and you feel that in your bones, I don't think you have any choice.
No, and I think you have to be prepared for that too. And what I always say to people is to be prepared for that service to end, but also to be mindful of preparing for that. So what we don't want is to become another in a revolving door of practitioners where, hey, we've uncovered something hinky here. Something doesn't quite seem right. We've asked a question. Ooh, they haven't liked the question we've asked, so we've just gotten kicked off the case. Now it's the next person to come in. So I always say, where's your paper trail? Where, where can we be? If you have to report this, where's your permanent product? Are you reporting that in a report, in a documentation, in a report back to the NDIS? Like, how are we making sure that we're not trying to vilify people, but how are we making sure that this really important information for people's human rights and safety isn't getting just passed along, because we keep having this revolving door.
And what we've talked about there, the two ends of it, is our duty to protect somebody's human rights by re-educating and providing this ongoing support to change practice. And then at the sharp end, pointy end of it, when we've seen out and out abuse and we have that obligation. So I'm just going to move it so I can read it. Yeah, so Diane said, in experienced pracs, assuming core, putting in RPs would require high quality supervision for these practices. And
they should be having high quality supervision anyway, I want to say, just straight off the bat.
And they shouldn't be signed off from the supervisor unless discussions are had and discussing the functional behaviour assessment and completing a risk assessment. Absolutely. I'd agree with all of those points.
Yeah.
But
that goes back to your point too about conducting a behavior risk assessment when we're considering any form of restriction or restrictive practice or any sort of risk, is like, because we're not just considering risk about the person in the restrictive practice, we're considering, the risk to whom. So, if we're talking about physical restraint, like there's a risk to staff anytime you and that's often why I think there's an emphasis on, or maybe a mismatch between the focuses on restrictive practices versus where they're coming from. Like from organizations, there's a lot of focus on, worker safety, OH&S, and work safety around that, while at the same time balancing the dignity of risk with the duty of care of the individual and the other people within that environment as well.
And I do think that sometimes can get forgotten at the front end, is that worker safety is also paramount. And implementing providers, one of the things that I talk about to the people who I supervise is, don't forget, if you find a residual or an unmanaged risk, you're going to have to be really clear with the implementing provider about that, because that's a workplace health and safety issue that they need to try and manage, because we have a responsibility where we see that to highlight that to them, because they may not realise that's there. We'll see that when we conduct our risk assessment, and arguably they should be undertaking their own risk assessment and see it, but they may not, dependent on how they look at it. So we do have an obligation to make sure, and remember that if you've got a workplace health and safety risk, that will trump any other risk that you're dealing with, in terms of legislative provision. And certainly if you look at some of the recent sort of media and cases that have been highlighted, worker safety was paramount in some of those decisions. And so we do have that balance to think about. We can't forget that.
Are you able to talk a little bit more about that, like about worker safety, that example that's been highlighted in the media? Because I'm not quite sure which one you're referring to, and I'm not sure if it's okay to talk about.
So the recent media related to the Lifestyle Solutions judgment,
where they
emphasised that there were safety issues for staff, and I don't know the details. Most of us won't know all of the details. You'll be able to read the judgment, and there are more legally qualified people than me who'll pore over that, I'm sure. But I suspect one of the things that sometimes does worry me is that we have to balance the rights of everyone, and so one of the things that does sometimes worry me is we forget that in the mix, because we're being so focused in one direction, and we need to consider that we've got people, and and we're some of those people who work with people who have some pretty high risk behaviours, and we need to try and ensure their safety so far as possible.
Yeah.
I'd be a liar to say I've done this sort of work for the amount of years I've done it and not been assaulted. I've been assaulted at work.
Me too.
But we need to try and prevent that happening to people so far as we possibly can, and make the workplace safe while still respecting the human rights of individual people and improving their quality of life. And that can sometimes, be a really difficult balance to try and achieve.
I'll say that it's especially difficult to achieve within a family home where there's, let's say, an individual child that's your client, but let's say the parents are being assaulted or siblings are being harmed. And the focus is on the individual and, functional replacement behaviors and the behavior support plan about the individual. But oftentimes we forget about the psychosocial harm for the siblings, the actual harm on siblings. We think about, I think we're better at considering parent and caregiver burnout than we have been in the past, but that's something that I think we can do better at as practitioners, is looking at the whole picture and the whole context, rather than, because behavior doesn't exist in a vacuum.
No, of course. And also, those family units are very often absolutely shattered. They're exhausted. And so the expectation that is sometimes placed on them to put in complex interventions.
It's hard coming in, and here's all these strategies, and people are just trying to keep their heads above water. They're just trying to survive.
I mean, I once had a mum say to me, "This is all well and good, but I just want to cook a meal without being hit." And that was a pretty good summary of where she was at that point.
Isn't that a goal? Like, let's start
that
there.
was her goal. I just would like to be able to make a meal without being hit. And she would, and she'd gone to extraordinary lengths actually to try and supervise her daughter whilst making meals and keeping everybody safe in the house. I mean, she really had gone to extraordinary lengths, and there was us coming in on our white Charger going, you can't do that.
And it's like Angie's just said, I've always believed there needs to be sibling funding for their own support. And as Lee has mentioned, I also think that frequent changes in practitioners is making it worse for carers. Absolutely. They've had, as Lee said, families who've worked with 3 practitioners over 6 months. I mean, that's on the smaller side, I'd say. And I think I feel for particularly parents and carers. Like, I love it when they want to interview me beforehand. That tells me 2 things. They actually want to make sure that I'm worth investing their time and their energy in, because they've told their stories so many times, and it's exhausting. But that also tells me that they've been burned in the past, and they've probably had a revolving door of practitioners, or they may have had practitioners who have been overwhelmed, and who either have been overwhelmed and they haven't known what to do. So they just kind of like, there's that inertia that comes from not knowing what to do next. But then we can't also deny the reality that there have been some unethical providers that will drain the entire behavior support package and then be like, not for me, see you later. And then there's no support and no funding.
I think most people are trying to do the right thing and trying to do what's the right thing for families. But I think we just have to be really humble. When I think about that lady in particular, because she was, like, at that time, I'd have probably been in my early 30s, and she would have been a little bit younger than I am now. And she's got me coming in, telling her how to run her house and look after a young adult daughter, And she's somebody I still talk about in my trainings, because we formed a great bond, a great relationship. And I think what she liked about me was, she used to say, you're no nonsense. I know where you're coming from. Other people come in and they give it all, and she said, you come in, you're a bit no nonsense. I know what it is you want to do and what you're trying to achieve. And we did have a really, really good relationship. And I did we did make some massive changes for her daughter. But I would say it's the relationship was everything, and I still believe that the relationship stuff is the relational stuff is so important. And I know you all know this. You know, I'm preaching to the converted, really. But if you can develop that trusting relationship, people will follow you into just about anything. You know, and they'll keep going with you if they trust in what you're saying.
Yeah. I just came from a community practice where I was mentioning, you know, somebody was mentioning about rapport building, and I think rapport building is kind of getting a bad name now. But the thing is about rapport building is that it's not necessarily linear, and rapport building is part of your assessment. You're assessing the readiness of the agents of change. Like if you're, and that's, I've worked recently with a family who were at such burnout, and they've been through, you know, so many practitioners that have done that churn and burn, that I knew what I needed to do. Instead of me telling what I was going to do, is I just needed, it was how I needed to show up, and it was how I showed up. They needed to be seen rather than told. You know, I needed to show them rather than tell them. So I'm going to be there when I say I'm going to be there. I'm going to be there alongside of you, coaching, modeling. Because if we talked about this, you know, we've talked about this so much, that change doesn't come from a report or a plan in itself. It's our guidance. But the change comes from doing the doing. And the more we can do alongside with people, the more they trust us as allies rather than see us as adversaries. And that can come across, especially when we're dealing with practices that are questionable or that might be infringing on people's human rights potentially.
Well, and Diane said she loves the approach of being you know, you're the expert, telling the parents that they're the expert. And that's one of the things. It always amazes me how often people will say, or make negative comments. I'll just leave it at that, shall I? And
so diplomatic of you.
About parents, you know. And I just think, if you know, try walking in their shoes for just 10 minutes, and I think you might last 5. And one of the I've got a little story on this one. Years ago, when I was a younger person, but I just got my first job as a manager. And I was managing a community service where for people who, it was a residential service for people who had quite extreme behaviours, to be fair. And there was a young man living there who would talk incessantly about his mum, his dad, his brothers, his sisters, and it was one of the things he used to talk about all the time. Every day he'd talk about them, and they only came once a year to see him, which was on his birthday. And sometimes it'd be mum and dad, and sometimes it'd be mum, dad, and one of his siblings. And a member of staff came to me one day, like the day before they were due to visit or whatever, and started to say, basically sort of, you know, how horrible of them to only come once a year, and why would you only do that, and this is cruel, and made all these sort of statements about this family. And I just said to her, you know, if you truly think that about this family, then maybe you're in the wrong job, because actually you don't understand them, you don't understand anything they've been through. This might be the most difficult day of their year coming to see him. This could be the most difficult thing they have to do. And your job is to make that as pleasant as possible for everybody. It's not to question it. It's not to cast aspersions. It's to do the best you can for him and for his family to make this as successful as possible. And like, she had no understanding from like it, and the reason she got that reaction from me is because it triggered something in me because of my own family's experience with my brother, who had a disability. And so it sort of triggered me. I was incensed, if I'm honest, and I managed to hold on to how incensed I was, but just give her a response that I felt was professional but to the point, you know. And I think so often we stand in judgment of people without understanding their life experience or what's occurred for them. And we never will. you know, just like nobody can understand your experience, nobody can understand my unique experience. It's the same for the people who we support and their families, and we need to remember that. And if we're talking about human rights, that's being respectful of other human beings, and we just have to try and hold on to that and harness that.
Yeah. And I think approaching the role with empathy, you know, is such an important, it's such an important characteristic of what we bring to the role, in that we hold a very strong responsibility when it comes to compliance and ethics and human rights. And yes, we do, but we also are in a very privileged position where we're invited into people's lives. We're invited into their homes. We're invited into, into sometimes the most intimate of you know, questions and details. And there's a responsibility that comes with that I think we really need to always come across with an air of humility and compassion and empathy, in that you don't necessarily know what other people's circumstances are. However, people tend not to call us as behavior support practitioners when things are going well. Usually it's because the poo's hit the fan and we need some help. So having some empathy and some compassion and going,
go a long way.
Hard. I can see that this is hard. That goes a long way.
Yeah.
We've got a few more time. We've got about 15 minutes for some more questions here. One of the questions we had is what to do, where to go with an adult with an intellectual disability is the victim of abuse or neglect by either, well, let's say by a family member. So where do we go to? Because I have two parts to that question. So one is when it's a family member with an intellectual disability who are perhaps being neglected or abused. What do we do?
Well, see, I still think if it's straight up neglect and abuse, we have to report that to whomever is the appropriate authority.
And that depends on your state and territory. Yes. Yeah. Like here in Victoria, it'd be OPA, it'd be the Office of the Public Advocate.
Yeah. Oh, would it? See, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. You might, and don't correct me if I'm wrong, it might be, you'd start with OPA. And yeah, they might go. Where would you report in Queensland?
So if it's a child safety. If it's an adult, we'd use reportable incidents through the NDIS, and we could try and report.
Yes, correct. Yes, so we would absolutely report it. We would report to the NDIS, but as far as like, hey, we need an authority to step in here, like if it's a child,
so then it's similar then. It's a similar process, then we might look to other agencies as well for assistance if it's more immediate. I mean, we had a terrible case a few years ago in Queensland where two young boys, I think, died in a family home and nobody seemed to know they were there. That was a bit of an unusual one. You wonder how that ever happened.
No. Oh, it's really
but absolutely. I think if what you're dealing with is absolute abuse, and there's no question about that, you don't have any choice. But, you know, professionally, you are obligated to report that. And I've certainly been in the situation, and I bet I'm not the only person, where other people have said to me, oh, don't report that because blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I'm reporting.
No, I err on the side of caution. And the other thing is when it's a service provider. So I know the NDIS has come out with some recent advice around sharp practices and exploitation. And we have our own policy in my practice around it's a policy around concerns regarding exploitation and poor quality of care. So I think the NDIS has come out with some new resources around sharp practices and definition of sharp practices.
For those who very recently they did,
for those who don't know, definition of sharp practices, I'm going to paraphrase, but it's things like it's almost akin to like human trafficking. Like, oh, you've got $1 million NDIS plan, come and join our service and you'll get, a takeaway every night and a free flat screen TV, and in some circumstances offering really unethical and illegal things in some circumstances. So they did just, if anyone can link that in the comment if you do have it, but it is out there and it is fairly recent. But that's one thing when it's a family, but then when it's a service provider and you come across poor quality of care, sharp practices, we're not even talking about unethical, I don't even call it restrictive practices or unauthorized restrictive practices. Like in a lot of cases, it's just straight up abuse. Yes, they're technically unauthorized restrictive practices, but in other cases, it's just straight up abuse where we're just locking the person in the house kind of 23 hours or 24 hours a day. So keep an eye out for that. That resource is available. In those circumstances, obviously, be following that guidance from the NDIS and reporting to the NDIS, following your incident report. Follow what you need to do is, in some cases, I've gone out and done welfare checks with the police at 9:00 at night before for some of my participants after I've put in, done the due diligence and put in the report to the NDIS and tried to work with the provider where the provider has clearly said, we're not interested in working with you. And I was like, okay, I'm not going away though. You got the wrong provider if that's what you any other tips and tricks there? Because I think that's something that unfortunately is endemic within the NDIS currently. That
isn't.
It's a small, it is. I think it's endemic within the NDIS. Yeah. It's a small percentage.
Yeah.
But it is there. Is there any other tips and tricks you have there, I guess, or advice around that? That was some of the questions we had. What do we do?
I think as well, using some of your networks to have a conversation with other people about their opinion on something, because sometimes we see stuff and we're not sure.
Yeah.
So it's always good to test your thinking with other people. I still do that all the time.
Cecilia saw an incident report for a participant that the risk is not the risk for the participant or the people around them, but the financial risk of the provider losing the participant. We saw that in childcare actually recently. With the recent I don't know if it's gone off in Queensland the way it has in Victoria, but they're working with Children's Check and how it's just ineffective in the childcare industry, particularly in Victoria, and how it's not very well safeguarded. And one of that was published for one of the main providers is when they were doing a risk assessment, the primary risk that they were assessing was whether if the complaint about the child's care or abuse was going to be in the media, or if it was a risk of losing that placement at that childcare. And it seems like that's kind of similar to what Cecilia is referring to. Now, Asley's mentioned that sometimes we get plans with 20 plus preventative interventions, which are not realistically doable in 5 months or even a year, as it takes time to train families and participate in these strategies. What do you think is realistic? Because Kylie said that she thinks when there are 20 strategies and it's a practitioner throwing everything at it to say, look what I know, quote unquote, less can be more, especially with families. Start small, see a few wins. It's less overwhelming. I tend to agree with Kylie.
Obviously, we can only talk generalizations here, but I think somebody said 5 or 6, and I think 5 to 6, is, and that's Asley, is even 6 for me is like you're going so.
Yeah.
And also when you're working with families, so my normal advice is look at what the risk is you're dealing with, and prioritize the behavior that's most risk. Like that is my general advice. Now, again, I'm being generalized, so let's you have to bear with me a bit. But particularly with families, what I say is choose a quick win first. Find the quick win, because if they start to get those quick wins, they will be really motivated. Don't give them the most complex stuff to work with first.
I heard somebody say that once, that giving someone hope is an act of love.
Yeah.
Which it is, especially for desperate families. You give them that small win. My gosh, that could be a big game changer. What I
Well,
always do, I always do a treatment plan, is what I call it. Is like I may give, like my behavior support plan has all my strategies in it because it comes from my FBA. But we're not working on all my strategies. We're working.
yeah.
I'll develop, let's say, a treatment plan where I'll pull out 2 or 3 strategies that I have worked with the multidisciplinary team, like the OT, the speechy, the whomever, to say, hey, what are the primary goals here? Like you said, what are the risks? What are the main things we need to be working on? Cool. We're going to work on 2-3 strategies max, but these are Joe Blow's strategies. So we have 1, 2, and 3 that we're all feeding into from a multidisciplinary team. So we don't necessarily have, we may not have behavior strategies and OT strategies and speech strategies. We may have 3 strategies that we've all fed into, but they're Joe's strategies, so that we're all working to the same plan. And that's a way that we're using our resources, our hours, and we're not doubling up and we're not contradicting each other either. That's a really great
So
way
important.
to do it. But that also doesn't overwhelm people. It's like, I'll tell people, here's the whole plan just so you're aware of it, but we're only going to be working on like 2, maybe 3 of these things at a time maximum. Otherwise, it gets too overwhelming.
Yeah.
Yeah. And people are saying small, achievable, preventative strategies, not pressuring families, and with, not for, is such an important thing too. Like, I know that our travel's been cut, and that's the one thing that really bugbears me about the NDIS, is that when they remove the part of the travel, and I understand some of the rationale for it, however, I don't think they consulted with behavior support, because we're the ones that are walking through that environment going, hey, why is this lock on the outside of the door?
Yeah.
Like, why is this locked? Like, why is this plexiglass? Like, where is all the furniture? Like, that kind of thing. So that was an important safeguarding measure that I don't think was really robustly considered when that was decided. But here we are. We did the best we can. Now, we've got about 5 minutes left. Are there any burning questions that anybody has that you can pop in the chat that Sharon and I can speak to or help answer?
Oh, have a go at.
Yeah, that's right. We may not have
no
answers,
idea,
but we'll chat about it, and that's fine.
Yeah, I can say I have no idea, but this is what I think at the moment.
Yeah, and here's where to go for more information.
Yeah.
So we will be running another Behavior and Beyond in about 3 months. I don't think we've got the date yet, but we will. Can we have one of these every month? We'd love to.
You'd soon get sick of hearing us two natter.
I know you would get sick of hearing us talk. Sharon and I both do individual things. I know you've got a lot of training coming up too. And I'm going to plug you for you. You've got some amazing behavior risk assessment training coming up. Like, please do. If you're doing anything with restrictive practices, behavior risk assessments are an absolute must, and you will not find any better than Sharon Paley. So we can't do every month, but we will do every 3 months. This will be available on the Specialist Behavior website, and we are going to be having more courses coming from Sharon soon on the Specialist Behavior website.
Yeah, I tried to record one of them yesterday, but it recorded. I did the whole thing. You're going to love this. Me with technology. It recorded the whole thing, but not my voice. There's no sound on it at all. All you can see is my mouth going.
Emma's next to me going, oh my gosh, you poor thing.
Yeah. There's 45 minutes of me yakking and you can't hear a thing.
I'm sure you look fabulous, though.
I might send it to you just for a laugh.
Well, thank you so much.
I'm pleased other people are laughing too, because, you got to laugh at those things when you do them. And just go, I'm just an incompetent, technology, who knows?
I cannot tell you, when I first started doing the podcast, Behavior Bits podcast, it seriously took me at least 6 months just to be able to do that properly without it. It was a whole thing. Sharon, not the most technologically enabled, but we do our best. So thank you all very much for being here with us today. And thank you, Sharon, for sharing your knowledge and your experience. And we will see you in about 3 months' time.